The winter of 1942 came early to the southwestern edge of the Soviet Union. Snow fell in heavy layers over the hills, and the roads turned into a thick mix of ice and mud. In small villages scattered on both sides of the front, people lived in constant uncertainty. More and more often, the deep drone of aircraft echoed in the sky, and distant columns of smoke marked where fighting had passed. The war was moving eastward, leaving behind burned fields, shattered houses, and long tracks of steel carved into the frozen ground. In one of those remote settlements lived a man named Nikolai Trofimovich. He was nearly 50 and had spent most of his life tending sheep and horses in the hills. People knew him as a quiet, stubborn, and solitary man. The war had reached his valley too, but he remained. His sons had gone to the front in the first year of fighting, while his own age spared him from conscription. All that was left for him was to care for what little remained, the flock, the land, and the fading rhythm of a world now torn apart. From early autumn, the village had lived in growing fear. Rumors about advancing German armored divisions reached even the most remote farms. People hid their grain, slaughtered their livestock, and fled into the forests. Nikolai did not leave. He told those who did that the sheep would die without care, and that if everything was abandoned, there would be nothing left to return to. Every morning he still led his flock to pasture, as he had done all his life. The only change was in the air. The wind grew colder, and the sky seemed lower, heavier. By mid-December, the road to the west had grown silent. No soldiers, no refugees, only stray crows and the frozen marks of old wagons. Nikolai knew the front was close. At night he sometimes heard the distant rumble of artillery, low and resonant like thunder behind the hills. When that happened, he would step outside, stand by the gate, and listen. Then he would go back in, throw more logs into the stove, and wait for dawn. Life went on, suspended between habit and dread. One day, everything changed. In mid-December, as the snow hardened into a crust of ice, Nikolai saw a flash of metal far off on the ridge. At first he thought it was sunlight on the ice, but then he recognized the straight reflection of moving steel, tracks, tanks. Soon the deep roar of engines rolled across the valley. The earth trembled underfoot. His flock clustered together in confusion, and he felt a coldness rise along his back, not from the wind, but from the weight of realization. By evening, the tanks appeared clearly on the crest. The column moved slowly, cautiously. It seemed to be a reconnaissance unit, searching for a route through the valley where an old supply road wound between the hills. It was the shortest path eastward, but also the most treacherous hidden ravines and loose snow could trap even the heaviest vehicles. Nikolai knew every curve of that land, every stone. He understood that if the tanks came through the valley, they would pass directly through the village and reach the bridge beyond. Beyond that bridge there were no troops, only open road into the hinterland. He stood on the slope, watching the machines approach. There was no fear or anger in him, only a strange, focused clarity. He had heard of what happened in nearby villages, houses burned, civilians driven out, people taken away. He knew that if the column entered his valley, nothing would remain standing. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the fire, listening to the wind. The blizzard outside howled like a restless spirit. He knew that by morning the column would move again. Somewhere deep inside him, something hardened into resolve. He stepped out into the cold, looked over his yard, the old cart, the sacks of wool, the canister of kerosene left over from autumn. His thoughts were simple, wordless actions forming on instinct more than reason. He understood that if the road through the ravine could be blocked, the tanks would have to stop, and if something happened to make them believe there was an ambush ahead, they might turn back. In war, fear could do more than weapons. When dawn came, the storm had settled. On the horizon, the tanks appeared again, moving in a stretched formation, covering each other. Nikolai stood above the road, hidden behind the ridge where the wind had stripped away the snow. He could see everything without being seen. He led a few sheep down the slope, tied a barrel filled with kerosene to his sled, and made a crude torch from cloth and oil. It was his only plan, rough, desperate, but the only one he had. When the first tank reached the bend, Nikolai lit the torch and rolled the barrel downhill. It tumbled across the icy path, scattering snow, leaving a dark trail of smoke. Moments later, it burst into flames and exploded at the base of the hill. The ground shook, the air filled with heat, and the frightened sheep scattered in all directions. The column slowed. The tanks halted. Their commander, perhaps, thought the road ahead was mined or that there was an ambush in the valley. The engines stopped one after another. For several minutes, the silence was absolute, heavy as stone. Nikolai stood motionless, feeling his heartbeat echo through the cold. He did not know what would follow, only that the moment of stillness marked the beginning of something that could not be undone. For a long moment, the valley was silent. The burned barrel smoldered at the foot of the hill, and the smoke rose in slow, twisting ribbons. The sound of engines had faded, replaced by the faint hiss of cooling metal. Snow fell again, thin and steady, covering the black streaks of soot. The tanks remained still, as if frozen by the landscape itself. Nikolai stood in the same place, his breath mixing with the smoke. He knew they would not stay motionless forever. German units were trained to move quickly, to adapt, to push forward, no matter what stood in their way. But the terrain was deceptive, and fear of mines could stop even the boldest crews. He had seen this kind of hesitation before once, in the previous summer, when a column of Soviet trucks halted for hours because one vehicle had caught fire on a narrow bridge. The mind of a soldier always measured danger first. The tanks began to move again, slowly, cautiously. The first machine crept toward the bend, its gun turning from side to side. Men appeared on the armor, scanning the slopes. One pointed toward the smoking barrel. Another gestured toward the forest line. Their movements were sharp, mechanical, and the air filled again with the heavy sound of engines. Nikolai retreated a few meters higher, where the rocks gave him cover. His plan had worked only halfway. The explosion had stopped the column, but not turned it back. They would soon realize the fire came from nothing more than fuel and snow. When they did, the road to the village would be open again. The shepherd's thoughts moved quickly, but without panic. The snow was thick, the ice unstable. He knew the ravine below a narrow gorge where even in summer the ground stayed soft. If the lead tank tried to cross it, the ice might collapse beneath its weight. He decided to lead them there, not by fighting, but by deception, by shaping the landscape against them. He moved along the ridge, keeping low, using every rock and bush for cover. The snow muffled his steps. From below, he saw how the first tank hesitated near the bend. The commander shouted something, unheard, under the roar of the engine, and the column paused again. Then, one by one, the machines began to turn slightly east toward the narrow gorge Nikolai knew so well. He realized his chance had come. A few years earlier, he had dug a drainage trench there to stop spring floods. The ground underneath was hollow, filled with frozen mud and water. It would not hold steel. If the first tank went in, it would sink, blocking the rest. He moved fast, working with the precision of habit. He took the second canister of kerosene from his sled, poured it into the trench, and scattered dry grass over it. Then he climbed back up, lit another crude torch, and waited. When the lead tank reached the spot, he threw the torch down. A flash erupted, bright against the snow, and for a moment, the gorge looked alive with fire. The driver, blinded, tried to steer left, but the ice cracked beneath him. The tank tilted, its tracks digging into the mud. The next one behind it stopped abruptly. Engines roared, shouts echoed, and smoke filled the hollow. Nikolai watched without movement. He knew he could not destroy them, only delay. But every minute counted. Behind those hills, perhaps miles away, Soviet units were regrouping, laying new defenses. If the Germans were forced to stop, even for a day, it could mean survival for hundreds. The snowstorm returned, thick and blinding. The tanks struggled, trapped in the hollow. The shepherd turned back toward the village. His legs were heavy, but his steps were steady. He no longer thought about fear, or even about what would come next. He had done what he could, changed the course of a day in a war that had swallowed entire nations. That night, as darkness covered the valley, the sound of engines faded again. Somewhere beyond the hills, orders were being rewritten. And in the small, snow-covered village, no one yet knew that a shepherd had forced a tank column to halt not with weapons, but with the will of a man who refused to flee. By dawn the next morning, the valley had turned silent again. The fire in the gorge had burned out, leaving only a black scar on the white snow. The first tank lay at an angle, half buried in frozen mud, its turret tilted toward the sky. The others stood behind it, engines idling, sending slow waves of smoke into the cold air. The entire column was trapped by one simple misstep. From his shelter in the rocks, Nikolai watched the scene unfold. German soldiers moved carefully around the immobilized tank, testing the ground with poles, shouting brief commands. They were engineers, trying to measure the depth of the mud. A few men dug at the tracks with shovels, their movements heavy, mechanical. Hours passed. The snow kept falling. The machines stayed where they were. Nikolai understood that they would eventually free the tank, but time had changed its weight. What mattered now was delay. Every hour the column stood still. The front line somewhere beyond the horizon had one more chance to strengthen, to move, to breathe. He was a shepherd, not a soldier, but he understood the logic of endurance. Delay was survival. He spent the day in constant motion, circling the hills, observing from different angles. He counted vehicles, 12 tanks, several trucks, a half-track, a small command car. It was not a full division, but enough to break through an undefended village. If they reached the bridge beyond the valley, they could advance deep into the countryside. The thought filled him with a cold certainty. His small act, accidental or not, had forced an army to stop. At midday, a change began. The Germans brought out heavy cables and wooden planks, trying to build a path around the sunken tank. The engines roared again, echoing through the valley like thunder. The ice cracked and shifted under the weight of the machines. Nikolai watched as 2 of them slowly turned east, searching for a bypass along the ridge. He knew that route, a steep, narrow slope leading into an area of hidden wells and collapsed trenches from old battles. He had seen horses break their legs there, even in summer. If the tanks tried it, the ground would not hold, but there was nothing more he could do. The land itself would have to decide. As the afternoon darkened, he left his hiding place and returned toward the pastures. The sheep had scattered across the hills during the explosions, and he moved among them, gathering what he could. The work calmed him. The valley, though scarred by tracks and fire, still breathed the same slow rhythm of winter. Even amid war, it had not lost its stillness. In the evening, from the far slope, he saw the tanks again. 2 of them had slid off the ridge, tilted against the rocks, immobile. The rest stood clustered on higher ground, waiting for orders. The snow was now falling thickly, hiding shapes and blurring outlines. The column, frozen in place, seemed less like an army and more like part of the landscape. Nikolai returned home after dark. The house was cold, the firewood low, but he felt no exhaustion. Through the window he saw faint glimmers of distant headlights. A retreat, perhaps, or a repositioning. It no longer mattered. What he had done could not be undone. For one day, in one forgotten valley, he had stopped the forward motion of war. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping snow across the fields. The shepherd sat by the dying fire, and listened. The valley was quiet, the tanks were silent, and the night carried no sound of engines. Only the steady pulse of the storm remained, covering all traces of what had happened. The morning came pale and cold, the kind of light that carries no warmth, only clarity. Snow covered everything, the hills, the road, the scars of fire smoothing the landscape as if the valley itself wished to erase what had happened. The traces of battle lay hidden beneath a new layer of white silence. Only the barrel of the first tank remained visible, dark and rust-stained, jutting out of the drift like a frozen relic. Nikolai woke before dawn. The stove in his house had gone cold, and thin frost had formed on the window panes. For a moment he lay still, unsure if what he remembered was real or some long, vivid dream. But when he stepped outside, the silence told him everything. The tanks were gone. The air smelled faintly of oil and smoke carried from the direction of the gorge. He began walking slowly toward the ridge. The snow creaked under his boots, soft but deep. Where the column had stood, there were only frozen ruts and fragments of metal half buried in the snow. The Germans had withdrawn, leaving behind the sunken machine and a few abandoned tools. Their tracks led west toward the main road, toward the front that was now shifting once again. The valley, stubborn and cold, had defeated them not with strength, but with its shape, its weather, and the resolve of one man who refused to move. When Nikolai reached the gorge, he stopped. The first tank lay tilted into the mud, its tracks twisted, the hatch open to the wind. Snow had begun to fill the interior, softening its sharp lines. The sight was strangely peaceful, almost natural, as if the machine had simply chosen to rest there. He stood in silence for a long time. What had taken place over the past 2 days felt distant now, unreal, like an event witnessed through glass. He had not planned it, not truly. It had been instinct, the same instinct that guided him through storms and years of work on the land. In the following days, the weather grew harsher. Snowstorms swept across the hills, closing every road and isolating the valley completely. The shepherd returned to his routine. He repaired fences, split firewood, tended what remained of his flock. The war seemed far away again, though its echo lingered in every gust of wind that passed through the gorge. Sometimes he would stop his work and listen, certain he could still hear engines far off beyond the hills, but the sound always faded into nothing. Weeks passed before soldiers appeared, Soviet troops pushing west after a counteroffensive. They arrived in small groups, exhausted, their boots caked with ice. They found the tank frozen in the ground and the valley eerily quiet. They questioned the villagers, but most knew little. It was Nikolai who told them how the column had come and gone, how the land itself had trapped the machines. The officers listened, their expressions skeptical but respectful. They took notes, measured distances, and studied the terrain. It was hard for them to believe that one unarmed shepherd had delayed an armored unit, yet the evidence lay half buried in the snow before them. Before leaving, one of the officers explained to the villagers that the German column's delay had allowed reinforcements to reach the bridge to the east. Without that pause, enemy tanks might have crossed and struck deep into undefended ground. The delay, a handful of hours, perhaps less, had saved entire battalions from being cut off. No one wrote Nikolai's name in the reports. There were no medals, no mention in dispatches. But in the valley, people began to speak of it quietly, in the way rural stories are told. Part truth, part disbelief, part reverence. Spring came slowly. The snow receded, revealing the scars beneath churned soil, burnt grass, a few rusted shell fragments. The tank remained, sinking deeper into the softening earth. Children came to play near it, climbing the turret, sliding down the tracks, not fully understanding what it was. The villagers left it untouched. It became part of the landscape, as natural as the rocks and trees, a monument not built by men but left behind by circumstance. Years later, travelers would still notice it from the road. When they asked, the villagers would give the same answer. Once, during the war, a shepherd stopped a tank column here. They would not embellish the tale. They would not add drama. The story did not need it. The valley itself told it in its silence, in the way grass grew around the rusted metal and snow settled softly on the remains every winter. Nikolai lived many more years in that same house, tending fewer sheep with each passing season. He grew quieter, though his eyes retained the same steady light. He never spoke of what he had done, unless someone asked directly. When he died, the villagers buried him near the ridge, overlooking the gorge, where he had stood on that first morning. The wind there never stopped, and in spring the grass bent low, as if bowing toward the valley below. Today, nothing remains of the war except the fragments of iron and a fading story. The tank is little more than rust and shadow, half swallowed by the earth. But when the wind sweeps across the hills and the snow drifts over the old road, it is easy to imagine, that morning again, the frozen silence, the single man standing against the vast machinery of war, and the impossible stillness that followed. And though few believed it, the truth endures quietly in that remote corner of land. One winter morning, a shepherd stopped a tank column,